Hello and welcome back to the Rational Theology Podcast. Today we have back our most common guest, our most recurring guest here, Tarik LaCour. Welcome back, Tarik.
Thank you. It's good to be back. And if I'm your most recurring guest, I guess that I don't know what that says about the quality of the show, but flattered to be here. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, of course. And today's topic is going to be broadly the Kalam cosmological argument and how it ties into kind of LDS theology. And so Tarik has actually an essay coming out in the next edition of Element called "Does the Kalam Cosmological Argument End Mormonism?" Right. So it's a
Spoiler, no.
yeah. So it's a good little essay. But yeah, I guess we'll just get right into the argument. But I guess before we get into the specific formulation of this argument, maybe we'll just go over again what are cosmological arguments more broadly.
Sure. Well, cosmological arguments, broadly speaking, come from the word cosmos, meaning world in Greek. And so they're looking at features of the world and arguing that God or some necessary being is the best explanation for why that feature exists. So since we're going to use the Kalam cosmological argument, I won't use the Kalam as an example, but a very prominent cosmological argument in the history of philosophy comes from Leibniz. In his and his argument goes something like this, where there's you know there's contingent things, things that happen to exist but they could not exist, and then there's necessary things, things that couldn't fail to exist, they must exist. And then he asked the question, well, let's look at the universe. Is the universe a necessary thing? Could it not exist? And Leibniz says, it seems to me that it could not exist. There could be no universe. And those, so there has to be an explanation for why the universe exists. So this ties into his very strong principle, sufficient reason. There has to be an explanation. So he says, okay, so if the universe isn't the ultimate explanation, then what could be? Well, it'd have to be something that had enough power to bring the universe into being out of nothing, because the universe couldn't. It, the universe is kind of everything, right? So it couldn't be part of physical reality. It'd have to be something beyond the universe. So he finds that in God. So that's a common one. A similar argument to that is given by my hero St. Thomas Aquinas in the third way of the Summa of his five ways. It's called the argument from contingency, but it's not technically a cosmological argument because it's not looking at the universe as a whole. It's just talking about contingent things and necessary things, and there has to be a necessary being. And you can use that type of argument with the universe, like is the universe a necessary thing or not? So those that's the basic idea. Cosmological argument is looking at the cosmos as a whole and saying that there's something about it that only God can explain, so that shows you that God exists.
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, the way to remember that, right, is just cosmological, cosmos. Pretty
There you go.
simple. So,
Yeah.
yeah. But to get into the specific formulation here in the Kalam cosmological argument, uh, maybe do you want to talk about where does it come from, and then probably who repopularized it more recently.
Yes. So brief history lesson. So the uh, ancient Muslim philosophers, they preserved the writings of Aristotle, and they were very influenced by Aristotle, which is also why Aquinas also quotes them heavily, Al-Ghazali, Avicenna. And they were, and one doctrine of Aristotle is that the universe is eternal. It doesn't come into being. And for Muslims, that's a problem because the Quran seems to tell us that God created the world. So if the universe is eternal, that so there's a conflict between Aristotle and the Quran. So they're going to say, oh, there has to be some reason. But they're not inclined to say, well, because the Quran says this, then Aristotle must be wrong. There must be some reason outside the Quran that shows that the universe can't exist forever. So Al Ghazali and Avicenna, they gave arguments that argue that you can't have an actually infinite amount of things. So if their arguments work, they're saying, okay, look, if the universe is eternal, then there would have to be an infinite number of past events. But since you can't have an actual infinite, then the universe can't be it's past eternal. It has to have come into being at some point. So that was their argument. It was in the obviously in the early centuries after of the Muslim era. And William Lane Craig, who is the most popular, this is his most popular argument. He's written several books on it. He did his doctoral dissertation on it under John Hick at the University of Birmingham. And he gave some arguments for it, but he gave both scientific arguments for it and philosophical arguments for it. So he agrees with Avicenna and Al-Ghazali. Yes, there are philosophical arguments for showing you why there can't be an actual infinite number of things, but there is also scientific confirmation that the universe began to exist. So even if you said you can't establish on philosophical grounds, ontological commitment about what exists, is it fine? There's still scientific arguments you have to wrestle with. So Craig kind of combines the two, and then that's become probably the most prominent argument for God's existence in terms of it's what people who are like in the lay public who don't know a lot about philosophy, they'll know the Kalam cosmological argument, but in academia as well, it's been discussed endlessly in lots of journals, and so it's if there is an actual infinite, it's writing about the Kalam cosmological argument, it seems.
Yeah. And I guess a brief aside on William Lane Craig. He always talks trash on Mormon theology. And talks about how there's like no Mormon theologians to interact with, and so I've reached out to him to try to have him on the show, but he has not responded. So
I didn't
I don't know.
know.
Hopefully,
I didn't know you could even reach out to him. Like his email, I didn't even know was publicly available. So I've listened to his Reasonable Faith podcast from beginning to end. So yeah, I can resonate that he's not a big fan of Latter-day Saints.
yeah, yeah. I don't have his personal email, but his through his whatever it's called, he's got like a way to reach out, and so I went through that alley. I don't know. We'll see if anything comes of it.
He, go,
Um,
he goes on everyone else's podcast. I don't see why he won't go on your podcast. And
yeah,
I mean, so we'll see.
yeah, we'll see. But yeah, I guess in its logical formulation, the Kalam cosmological argument, right, is pretty simple. It's just a syllogism. It's just everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Um, yeah, so I guess, obviously, do you think the argument is sound in the first place?
It's logically valid. That means if the
Right.
premises lead to that conclusion, that's right. I would say, since I'm writing against it, I don't think it's sound. It would be silly to say that something is sound and that you're arguing against it. So I don't think it's sound.
Right.
I think it's very, for philosophers who rely a lot on intuition, it has a lot going for it. Uh, and it's certainly not one that you should just dismiss out of hand. Recently, Richard Carrier on his blog called the Kalam Cosmological Argument BS. Uh, yeah, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think the argument doesn't work, but it's not unreasonable. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so why don't you think that it works? Is it on like the scientific grounds or
Yes. So now Craig has written a lot of books. So, and Craig has written on this philosopher in particular, but when you're, I don't think you can establish things that exist outside of empirical premises. So the philosophical arguments for the infinite don't move me very much. So I'm more with Quine and Aquinas on that. Oh, this is another point that's important here. A person who was a proponent of this argument, or an argument very similar to it, was Saint Bonaventure, who was a scholastic, and Saint Thomas Aquinas, who, as you know, is my idol. He actually wrote a book talking about you can't prove that the universe had a beginning. It's like it just there's no way to prove that. So he said, and you shouldn't use arguments that are based on probability because they're not as strong as arguments that are more certain. And these are the ones that you need that are going to be the biggest push against skeptics. So he was long before Craig. He was very skeptical of the argument, but Saint Bonaventure also defends something very much like the Kalam cosmological argument. But as far as the premises, so let's go with premise one first. So everything that begins to exist as a cause, I would say I think that premise is sound because all of our knowledge of the world is things being caused by something else, and anything that begins to exist, whether it's a table, a chair, or a human being, we see it coming from a cause, and we can draw a causal line to how it came to be what it is. So I think the causal arrow is, and the causal principle is very scientifically based. Um, Even another one of my heroes, David Hume, made a big point of this, where he said, "I would never assert that you could something could come into being from non-being." He wrote this in a letter to a friend who thought that in his treatise, Hume was saying that things could come into being out of nothing. He's saying, no. He said, we know that things can't come into being out of nothing, but how do we know that is the question. So he's saying that's an empirical, not a priori thing. So I fully endorse the causal principle, as Craig puts it there. There are some people who would say quantum mechanics gives you good counterexamples, but those aren't popping into being out of nothing. They're being caused by the quantum vacuum. Now, why they're doing that, we don't know why it does that. Now, that's a different question, though. You can say, okay, this happens spontaneously and we don't know why, but we do know there's a cause for it. But we don't know why the cause did it now rather than another time. So I don't think quantum mechanics really does anything to undermine the causal principle. So the first premise I would agree with. Now, the second premise is that the universe began to exist. Now, this I think is very contentious and I would say underdetermined. Um, First of all, we don't have a fully worked out model of how the universe came into being or whether it's eternal. We just, at this point, we just don't know. That's something I put into a big part of this, is saying, look, let's take the standard model particle physics. If you accept that, and Sean Carroll, who's a very prominent physicist, he was on Closer to Truth recently. He thinks the standard model, isn't going to be replaced per se. Okay, so that kind of tells you it has that lends the idea towards a beginning a little bit on the standard model. The problem is the standard model is based on general relativity, which we know isn't right because it conflicts with quantum mechanics, and we don't have a way to fuse quantum mechanics with general relativity fully. It could be that they're incompatible and we'll need an entirely new theory. It could be that they are compatible and we just haven't figured out which way to do it yet. But as of yet, we don't know. And there are models of quantum mechanics that would allow the universe to be eternal. I'm not endorsing them. I'm basically, I would say I'm kind of agnostic, maybe more like Aquinas, in saying I just don't think you can prove it one way or the other. And I think, but more importantly, I think Craig kind of overblows the evidence for it being there being a beginning. One of his primary points is just that the so one point he makes is that general relativity implies a beginning. It's like, well, that is true as Einstein originally formulated it, but that doesn't blend with quantum mechanics. And of course, remember, this is something I think we can say for sure. Space and time are not necessary. So they're emergent from something else. What that something else is, again, we don't know. This is why it's a great time to be a physicist, because we're just pushing to the really fun edges. But we don't know that yet. Another point would be he uses this is the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. So this is a theorem by the scientist Alan Guth, Alexander Vilenkin. Vilenkin's at Tufts. Guth, I believe, was at Harvard. I can't no, wait, was Guth at Harvard? I forget. But and then Borde, and so their idea was this. They're like, look, if the universe, we know for sure the universe is expanding. It's getting much bigger. So, and it's getting bigger much faster. So, and Guth is the father of inflationary theory, and inflationary theory is about the universe expanding, getting bigger. And they're saying if the universe has been, on average, in a state of inflation, then it has to have a beginning because inflation can go on forever, but it can't have gone on forever. It can't be past eternal. So Guth, they all and all those agree on them. So therefore, Craig infers, so there must be a beginning. Well, that only works if the universe has always been in an inflationary state. We don't know that yet. Furthermore, this is important too. Guth and Vilenkin do not agree about the implications of their own theorem. So for Vilenkin does think, now this I want to give credit to Craig for, Vilenkin does think that the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem shows that the universe had a beginning, or it's very likely that it did. In science, you can't be absolutely sure, right? Guth, on the other hand, thinks, no, I still think the universe is eternal. So that would just show at least the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is underdetermined because its own philosophical fathers can't agree on the outcome. But the other point is the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is based on classical space-time, the space-time of general relativity again, and we can't use that to kind of because we're just not sure how general relativity will be reconciled in the end with quantum theory. So you don't want to make large metaphysical explanations of that sort based on the theory. Although not, of course, the general theory of relativity tells us a lot about space-time, and of course it's our best model. But we're just not in a position, as I say, we're very underdetermined whether the universe began to exist or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good overview of of the science. And yeah, I think I'm toying with the idea of minoring in physics. I kind of just have by hobby watch lectures
Are
sometimes, but
are you good at calculus?
we'll see. I took it in high school. I
Well,
mean, it wasn't
if you're not good at calculus, that's not going to work.
right. Yeah. So I'll see. I'm taking a calculus class in the fall, so I'll see if I like it or not. Um, but yeah, I think I feel like Craig does kind of overstate how certain we are in certain things, and I think is at least how certain he is of his argument should be tapered a little bit. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I guess now to move on to kind of the other side of it, even if it is sound, let's just assume it is sound, would it pose like life-ending problems for Mormonism?
All right, well, let's see how he applies this to Mormonism. Now, the Kalam cosmological argument, this is what he's trying to establish, that there's a first cause of the universe, and that this cause would have to be outside of space and time, which would be obvious because if the beginning of the universe is the beginning of time and space, then it can't be spatio-temporal. And then it couldn't be physical because Craig defines the physical as that which is not spatio-temporal. So, okay, so it's outside space-time. It has to be enormously powerful, and it have to be personal because it decided to do this at one time rather than, sorry, and I'm using time there as a figure of speech because the being is outside of time. But it's saying, okay, it had to have chosen that because otherwise this effect would just be eternally doing this. All right, so basically, and he says that this kind of shows this is pushing you toward a classical theist model of God. Okay, well, that's the point of the Kalam cosmological argument, that you will get a first cause of the universe. Now, this is where he kind of uses it against Latter-day Saints. So in the book, The New Mormon Challenge, he wrote an article with Paul Copan. And he said, look, he said, if Big Bang cosmology is right, which is what which is what he's basing the second premise on, is the Big Bang, then that shows that Mormonism has to be wrong because God's a spatio-temporal object, and so in order for that to work, then the universe would have to be eternal. But Big Bang cosmology says it's not. So therefore, that won't work on the Latter-day Saint view. So that's where he thinks that that's kind of the dagger to Latter-day Saint theology, and then I argue that no, it isn't for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and I guess even to comment before, just before the LDS specific stuff, I guess another thing to mention is I don't know that it's widely accepted that the Kalam cosmological argument would even get you necessarily to the Christian, Trinitarian God. I feel like
I
I've
don't.
heard some people talk about how.
Well, I don't think any natural theologian would say that any argument for God's existence would get you the Trinity, outside of maybe,
Yeah.
except I guess maybe the argument from the resurrection, which Craig also
Mm.
defends. But none of like Aquinas's arguments or arguments from Augustine or Boethius or anyone else would get you that. But that's not their point. The point
Yeah.
is the point of
Right.
natural theology is really to show that atheism is wrong. Once atheism's off the table, then you have revealed religion as a real live option. So
Yeah. Yeah. But no, the argument essentially gets you to a prime mover, and then Craig is like the Christian Trinitarian God is probably the best thing to fill in the blank. So,
right, and
um,
he
but
gives a cumulative case for Christianity, and that's just part of the case.
yeah, yeah. Um, so I guess something that you I think mentioned in your paper, which was interesting, was the I forget exactly what did you say again about how the LDS God being spatiotemporal isn't a problem for this argument.
Well, I said Craig is assuming a certain version of the Latter Day Saint view. So he's assuming,
Hmm.
as you well know, because you've had Blake Ostler on. I don't know if you guys talked about this part or not, but there's at least two conceptions of the King Follett sermon. One is that God has always been God, but the Father and the Son have both become mortal on different planets and lived a human experience. And then there's others like that. There's been an eternal regression of God's going all the way back to forever. Well, not going all the way back. It just keeps going and going. It's like a loop. Okay, let's take the first model first. So on the first model, on Blake's model, because he's the most prominent defender of that view, you could have the classical theist model and then just multiple incarnations of the Father and the Son. That's strictly compatible. I mean, it's not incompatible with Latter-day Saint views. There are some Latter-day Saint philosophers and theologians who are classical theists. I assure you that very, very small group, but it is an option. So if it's an option, then you haven't thrown it all out. It's kind of like saying, well, if you can overthrow divine simplicity, let's say you have a knockdown argument for simplicity, have you therefore overthrown Christianity? Well, no, because there's other views of God that are classically theist but reject divine simplicity. Craig, for example, rejects divine simplicity. Yet another thing he's wrong about. So that's one thing. The other is, even if there is a beginning, you could say that there's a God outside of this universe in another universe who's just creating another one. So all that really shows is the God of this universe couldn't just be a part of this universe. It would have to be outside of this universe. But that seems still to be perfectly fine. So, and another point I give here is, given this is a causal relationship, now, as I mentioned earlier, the causal principle is a big part of Craig's view. And so basically, all of our evidence shows us that, and let's just root this down to a physical cause, because the universe is a physical thing. So, what causes other physical things? Well, other physical things. So, actually, the Latter-day Saint conception makes more sense, because if the universe became to exist, the cause would still have to be, in some sense, physical if it caused this physical thing. So that was kind of the point. It's like, actually, if you think there's a cause of the universe, this cause would, in addition to all the other things, the cause would in some sense have to be physical, given that it's called the principle of causal closure, that only physical things cause other physical things. It's a pretty well established view in metaphysics. So given that, there really
Yeah.
doesn't there really doesn't seem to be a problem for the Latter Day Saint, I don't think.
Yeah. Something I was curious about was what do you think about do you think LDS theologians could even use some form of the Kalam cosmological argument?
If they're classical theists, they could. I don't. If you think that space and
Okay, but
time,
you don't think like a
if you think that space and time are in some sense necessary, I don't think so. If you don't think space and time are necessary, if you think that intelligences somehow exist beyond space and time, which in some sense is almost getting you back to like an Aquinas type of view of like angels almost, then yeah, you could certainly use it. I tend to doubt most people would, and that's because even though now again we haven't done any sociological evidence on this, but I would assume most people take the King Follett sermon in the B way that Blake calls it, that there's an infinite chain going back and that space and time are eternal in some sense. So they would be probably disinclined to using it. But I guess they could, but they'd have to reformulate it quite a bit. But the problem would be like, okay, but all you've done is explain, like, I guess I'd put it this way. Could they use the Kalam cosmological argument? Yes, but they'd probably fall prey to Aquinas and Leibniz's version of saying, okay, but why is there anything in the first place? You can't use these things to explain why there's anything at all. Only a classical theist type of God would do that. So short answer is yes, it's possible, but I guess it's unlikely.
okay. And you mentioned how there's some LDS philosophers that are classical theists. Do you have any like examples of that or any writings?
My friend Michael Severing, who's actually he has a paper coming out in Dialogue in the same issue that my paper's coming out in. He's a classical theist. Um, my friend, why am I blanking on his name? Come on, come on, come on. Don Bradley. There you go. He's also influenced by David Bentley Hart, who wrote the book The Experience of God. So he considers himself a classical theist as well. He's not technically a theologian; he's more of a historian, but he's a classical theist. So that's two. I think Blake's view is not really that far away from classical theism, and sometimes it just sounds like it to me. So I would guess he's warmer to it than he likes to admit. But so yeah, and let's see. Orson Pratt kind of is in a way.
Hmm.
So those would be some people.
Yeah. And
Now,
so I
I
guess
that's that. Well, I would say they're neoclassical theists. The last two, I would say Blake and Orson Pratt. On the classical
yeah.
side, Michael and Don would be classical.
Okay. And do they reject the idea of like a corporeal God or is it just more like a modified?
Well, corporeal doesn't necessarily. You can be incorporeal, but not necessarily immaterial. So the Stoics,
Hmm.
for example, thought of God as incorporeal, but that didn't mean immaterial. The same Aristotle also didn't mean immaterial by incorporeal. So yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
What would be the difference exactly?
I guess a body is extended in space and time, and an incorporeal thing wouldn't have to be.
Okay.
Even,
Interesting.
but I guess I put it this way: an incorporeal thing could interact with space and time, but it wouldn't itself be spatio-temporal.
Okay. Yeah.
So that would be the idea. That would be basically my view. I mean, I'm a classical theist of the Thomist view, but my view is that God is in some sense physical since he interacts with the physical world and brings it into being. And
Interesting.
also
Interesting.
on Also, given the fact that of the incarnation and also transubstantiation, which is the that the uh, bread and wine after consecration become the body and blood of Christ. It seems that like God seems to have no problem with like being physical, so maybe that's just because God, in some sense, is physical. But that's my view. Now,
Hmm.
God's physicality is very different from the physicality of physics, but physics keeps showing us that physicality is a lot deeper than we used to think because as I mentioned, Craig defines physical as spatiotemporal, but we already know that space and time are not fundamental just on physics grounds. So, but physicists still think there's something underlyingly physical about everything. So, the physical is just deeper than space and time,
Yeah, interesting.
which
I
is
guess
a
to
bit,
kind of circle back to
which is very haunting when you think about it.
yeah, to kind of circle back to something you said earlier. You said you accept the causal principle, and I feel like you said that things can't come from nothing. Or am I
Right.
misremembering here?
That's right. To quote Aristotle, that there would at least have to be an efficient cause of something, something,
Okay, interesting.
something,
So,
something that has the power to bring it into being.
okay,
Yeah. So,
interesting. So
so
that
that's
that's still squareable with creation ex nihilo.
yes, because God's all powerful, He can bring things into existence out of nothing. But since God exists, that's not nothing coming into being from nothing.
Oh,
Creation ex nihilo
okay, okay,
means that there wasn't anything outside of God that God used to form the universe. So
right,
God created rather than crafted.
okay,
Versus on the Latter Day Saint view, I mean, if you could see, I mean, there's a lot of different ways of doing this since Latter Day Saints haven't fully developed this yet. But you could have like there's God existing forever, and there's all this unformed intelligence. We'll use that for a better word since it's not matter as we know it now. Uh, and then that's co-eternal. Classical theism would say no, only God is the only eternally existing thing. So there's not something outside that's just eternalism. God could eternally create the matter, but it would still be causally dependent on God, and God's not causally dependent on anything else.
hmm
So
hmm
yeah,
interesting.
I mean that's the big kind of divide between God and everything else is that God is the only thing that can exist on its own.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I guess is there any other intricacy or facet of the argument or its connections to LDS theology you want to go over?
Well, no, but I guess this is one. I think it's, I think that Craig and other people who critique Latter Day Saint theology tend to do so because Latter Day Saint theology isn't as systematized officially.
Yeah,
There are people who have done it, so there is a drawback to not having a systematized theology. It's like, okay, no one knows what to attack, so they'll just attack things that have been repeated a lot, and then people can come around and give a more sophisticated view. But if there's not an official view, it's really hard to have a dialogue. And since the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is very committed to interfaith dialogue, it should have some commitment to having a more systematic theology.
it
Now,
would be nice.
one thing that some people would say was like, well, that leaves open that means that you couldn't square that with revelation. It's like, well, you can leave certain things open as saying, okay, on this matter, we're not fully no, and also even with things that are settled, you can always have a deeper understanding of it. But there are still some
Yeah,
things you can hash out.
right. Yeah, I think we should at least have like at least like a semi-officially endorsed like working systematic theology, because I mean, just with the nature of open revelation, things are gonna inevitably change in the future. But I think there's no harm in forming some sort of a working systematic theology with the current state of affairs. And in fact, that's one of the main things I plan to do in my academic career. So
Well, I guess your biggest competition right now would be Blake Ostler, right?
competition.
Well,
I guess that's one way to characterize it.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I guess I'm thinking of people like Latter-day Saints who have done systematic theology. That would be B.H. Roberts, Orson Pratt to a degree, but nothing like as big as Roberts. Blake.
Widso kind of.
I don't think rational theology is really like systematized. I think it's more like
Yeah.
competent. I think it's like the build. It's almost like, okay, Widso takes a few things like most Latter-day Saints will accept, and he says, okay, what can you build out of that?
Yeah.
And I think it works.
I think it's towards
It's
some
towards
sort of
yeah.
systematic.
All right.
But yeah, I guess there's also a BYU Idaho professor who published these two volumes of, he calls it a systematic theology. I haven't read them, but it's at least it's towards a systematic theology. So
The point is, it's very thin on the ground, so you got
yeah,
you got lots of work to do.
right,
Mhm.
yeah. Well, I guess, do you have any book recommendations or paper, video stuff for
Uh, sh-
this?
sure. Craig wrote a book. His dissertation is the Kalam Cosmological Argument. You can find that on Amazon. He has a more updated version of it in his book Reasonable Faith. So there's that. Some good critiques of it would be in Graham Oppy's book Arguing About Gods. He has a section on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Another person who critiques it is Jordan Howard Sobel in his book Arguing About Gods. I'm sorry, no, Logic and Theism. Arguing About Gods is by
Yeah,
Graham Oppy. Um, Other like theistic philosophers who have kind of critiqued it are Ed Feser. Feser's a Thomist. He's critiqued it on his blog, but he's talked about there are a lot of aspects of it that we didn't talk about, like the nature of time and things like that. Um, Blake Ostler has written some on it. His
yeah,
critique is very different from mine. So yeah, that's
yeah.
a good.
And then also, I think, and I'll link also the New Mormon Challenge where he writes the
Right.
specific LDS critique as well.
Right.
But yeah, I guess
Oh, and
that
one other book by Craig. There's a book by him and Quentin Smith. Now, Quentin Smith was an atheist philosopher, but it's on Big Bang cosmology. So their book is also very good on this. So you have two kind of competing voices back and forth, which is very refreshing. And they're friends, so they got on well and had a good conversation.
yeah, sweet. Well, thank you, Tarik, for coming on. Thanks for writing that essay too. It was great to read it. And when does Element come out with?
Uh, I think in the next month or so. So
Okay, sweet. Well, yeah. Hopefully, I'll update the YouTube description when that comes out as well. So,
great.
yeah. But yeah, thanks for coming on, and we'll see you next time.